Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Green Flame, the broadcast that brings you radical analysis, practical skills, and artistic expression from the revolutionary movement to defend the planet and rebuild just human communities. I am your host and comrade, Max Wilbert. Okay, I'm here today with Tom Grotewohl. Tom is one of the founders of Protect the Porkies, which is a community organization fighting a proposed copper mine in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Tom, would you tell us a little bit more about your background, where you're from, and how you got involved in this issue?
Sure. I was born in Kansas City, which is a place full of very nice people, but it's right in the middle of a lot of concrete and cornfields. And, I kind of felt in my soul what a lot of people feel these days. There's that great quote by Henry David Thoreau about feeling like nature is this vast epic poem and a lot of the best pages have been ripped out. And that you look up at the night sky and he felt like stars had been plucked by a demigod so that he could never see them. And he wrote this 150 years ago, right? So think about how folks feel today. So as I was looking for a place to lay down my roots, I started looking at maps of agricultural chemical pollution, of light pollution, of population density. And without going too far west, the place that kept popping out in the map was the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, as well as northern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin. So I moved up here a few years ago. I made my home a place right next door to Lake Superior, right next door to the Porcupine Mountains, right next door to the North Country Trail. It was a place so spectacular and beloved by so many people that I naively believed it was safe from a massive industrial operation. And then I started hearing whispers of a so-called copper mine. It's actually not a copper mine. We'll get into that later. But it had been proposed for 15 years. And because it hadn't materialized, local people were telling me not to take it seriously. Nothing's ever going to happen. But then last summer, I started hearing the sounds of heavy machinery. I could hear them from my homestead. I could hear them from Porcupine Mountains State Park, where I was working at the time. I could hear the heavy machinery very audibly from the North Country Trail. And so I started, I thought, what is a service that I can provide is I can make a website and just put information out there. Because for me, it was so difficult to find out anything about the mine. I thought that just providing information and letting people make up their minds was the best thing I could do. And for a while, nobody was taking things too seriously, but then we released some video actually showing the work that was being done at the proposed mine site. They clear cut some 80 acres of forest, they rerouted seasonal streams, they destroyed wetlands. And that was really the wake up moment for a lot of people because believe it when I see it is what I had been hearing. And now folks were seeing that something was actually happening. You don't destroy all of this spectacular nature unless you're planning on advancing with your project. So that's brings us more or less to where we are today. There's a few more chapters I can fill you in on.
Okay. Yeah, I'm really curious to hear more about the organizing, what y'all have done so far, and what's happened since then. But first, just for folks who aren't aware, I've never been to the UP. I've never been to Michigan at all. So for me and for other folks all around the world and throughout this country and elsewhere who haven't been to the area, how what's it like there? Who are some of the animals and plants who live around you? I've heard of the UP as this, as you mentioned, a place that has been spared much of the ravages of industrial civilization thus far. Obviously, that's not entirely true everywhere on the planet. Even the most remote wilderness are affected by global warming, by acid rain, by plastic drifting out of the sky, by toxic chemicals, carried in groundwater and so on. All these different issues, mercury in clouds and atmospheric formations from coal power plants and on and on and on. But of course, certain places have taken the brunt far more than others. So what's the UP like, and what was your experience of relationship with the land and the water like when you moved there?
Yeah. So, I mean, when I moved up here, it was just so different from where I lived back in Kansas City, and we jumped into an off-grid cabin sort of setup as well. So as city kids with really hardly any know-how, I could put a hammer in a board, I could put in some screws, but trying to deal with living off-grid with no connection to the power grid or running water, it was a huge wake-up. And but the more I experienced it, the more cleansing it turned out to be. As far as how people can become familiar with what the ecology is like here, well, the first thing to note is that we're on the south shore of Lake Superior. Lake Superior is the largest freshwater lake in the world. It holds about 10% of the world's surface fresh water. So this is an incredible entity which is constantly affecting and creating the weather systems. It's spectacular to see the northern lights and the starry skies reflected over the lake. It's called Gitchigami, meaning big waters or big sea by the native Anishinaabe people. And right on that south shore of Lake Superior is Porcupine Mountains Wilderness. The Porkies are actually some of the oldest mountains in the world. So as a result, they don't really look like mountains anymore. They look like kind of big rocky hills because they've eroded over billions of years. But what's amazing about the Porkies and about the UP in general is this is where the conifer forests of the west and the deciduous forests of the east collide and start to mingle and mix. And the Porkies are especially amazing. The Porkies are what local people call the Porcupine Mountains because it's actually the largest mixed old growth coniferous deciduous forest remaining in the Midwest. And among that old growth forest, there is the largest population of old growth eastern hemlock trees, which have all but been, decimated by the woolly adelgid out east. So that eastern hemlock forest, it's like you're walking into a cathedral. You walk from the sort of brighter colored birches and maples where the light comes in and they have brighter bark, and then you walk into this dark old growth eastern hemlock forest, and it's a very spiritual experience. There are an incredible quantity of life forms that live here because you have the coniferous and the deciduous trees mixing. You get many different kinds of light systems taking place throughout winter, throughout spring. Um, there's wolves up here. That was one thing I wanted. I wanted to live in a place where there were actually wolves. And unfortunately, the mine site would be right where two wolf packs traverse back and forth. It would greatly fragment their habitat. There are, right now I'm listening to wood thrushes, pileated woodpeckers, all kinds of warblers and migratory songbirds coming through in the spring. On the mine site itself, there have been a number of species of special imports which have been observed. And of course, there's, all of these species are important. That's kind of a dumb way to talk about an animal or a plant. But these are creatures which have been identified with a label either of special concern, like the wood turtle, the bald eagle, of greatest conservation need, Cooper's hawk, northern flicker, ruby kinglet, brown thrasher. There's threatened species as well, the lake herring, the common loon, the peregrine falcon, and endangered species. There's the red-side dace, which is a fish endangered in Michigan, and of course the gray wolf, which is still listed as federally endangered. So from Highland Copper, that's the Canadian company who is seeking to develop this mine, from their own feasibility report, they've documented all of these creatures on the mine site or on the adjacent lakeshore. And that's how we have that information. So by their own admission, you can find these threatened, endangered, of greatest conservation need entities there. And supposedly there's a law to protect these life forms. And yet the state seems to be totally content with allowing a mine to move forward.
Yeah, I was just having a conversation with an exchange with my friend Will Falk, who's an attorney involved in the Thacker Pass campaign with me and has been involved in rights of nature work as well. And we were talking about how people have the misunderstanding that the Endangered Species Act actually protects endangered species, when the reality of what the Endangered Species Act means in a case like this is that you and I can't get a permit to kill endangered species, but a corporation can get a permit to kill endangered species. And in fact, if you or I try to interfere with that corporation's legal right to kill endangered species under their permit, our actions will be illegal. And it helps it helped me to articulate how these systems of regulatory law, they can be helpful in some cases. They're not to be totally dismissed. I'm not in favor of getting rid of the Endangered Species Act, but it's important to conceptualize them as very, very limited tools set up within a broader context of industrial expansion, economic growth, increase in mining, increase in extraction of all sorts to feed the growth of a society with an endless appetite for it. And the legal system sort of being set up to facilitate that with very, very limited checks and balances, methods of public input and so on to try and mostly, in my opinion, appease people's sense of democracy and desire to participate in decisions about their communities that they live in. It's kind of a harsh reality when I put it that way. But this is, of course, what, many political philosophers and people have talked about and written about for many years. Sheldon Wolin is one of the most famous in this country, and he talked about inverted totalitarianism, a system that masquerades as democracy, like the United States, but in reality is a corporate dominated system. And it's this sort of inverted form of totalitarianism where instead of a single dictator or an authoritarian figure like that, you instead have this illusion of mass democracy of rule by the people, when in reality behind the scenes is corporate power running everything. So we'll get more into that. That's kind of beside the point of this interview, Tom. But thanks for sharing a little bit about that. Like I said, I've never been up to that area, but I've heard a lot about it. I have a couple friends who live in the Broad region, and I've heard from them about, the moose and the foxes and cougars and beavers and some of the amazing wildlife out there. Um, and this really, it sounds like a refuge. It sounds like one of the last remaining refuges for wild nature in the Midwest, in the entire Midwest. I was just in Cleveland recently for the first time, and of course, flying across South Dakota and into the area, it was just agriculture as far as the eye could see, with barely a postage stamp sized area of some natural vegetation here and there, let alone, these big interconnected landscape scale corridors and landscapes that, allow the big carnivores like wolves to survive and allow for natural evolution to take place. So it sounds like a really, really special place. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about what happened next. So I imagine this area is pretty close to where you live. I mean, you said you heard the machinery, so it's a place you near where you live or near where you hang out sometimes. So what did you first see exactly when you went there? You talked about the clear cuts, but like more viscerally, what was the experience like of, going to this place that you thought was a haven, a refuge, and then I imagine, emerging out of the trees or driving down a road and seeing this clear cut, seeing the mining, the 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 exploration for the mining and so on, starting to destroy this place.
Yeah, it was very, very surreal because, at first you experience this sort of, ransacking of the environment through sound waves from a distance. And so I was in my garden listening to the songbirds, listening to the wind, and I could hear strange industrial noises coming over on the breeze. And I do live near the mine site. I'm actually, as far as I know, me and my partner are the only folks who live within a few miles of the mine site. And that's why we are in the position we are to be able to speak up and be able to put out this information. But I was curious to find the source of these sounds. And so I went to the North Country Trail. The North Country Trail is the longest of all national hiking trails. It stretches almost 5,000 miles from North Dakota to Vermont. So it's kind of like the North Woods' answer to the Appalachian Trail and the Pacific Crest Trail. And I was walking down this trail. It's one of my favorites for seeking mushrooms because there's almost never anybody on it. And the really weird thing was just the sonic experience of you're walking down this beautiful verdant path, no signs of development, but you can hear the heavy machinery. And heavy machinery, as well as a lot of industrial technology, creates what's called infrasound, which is very low frequency vibration, which often you can't even hear it, but you can feel it. That's how elephants can sense earthquakes. It's how a lot of creatures can sense volcanic eruptions and hurricanes. In other words, it's nature's way of communicating natural disaster. It creates stress and tension within us when we hear infrasound. They even use it in horror movie soundtracks. And so when you're walking down a nature trail, that's exactly the last thing you would expect to be experiencing is this uneasiness. That's why people come here to escape those hectic influences from the city. And so that first trip, I followed the sounds. They got louder and louder and louder. I took a turn off the trail. I walked less than 400 feet. So this mine site is right next door to the North Country Trail. And then I saw these machines, probably only 3 machines, but with 3 of these massive machines, 500 humans could a century ago. So the amount of carnage taking place was truly mind-boggling. I took some video, I put that out, and then I made a case of taking some repeat trips. Each time I saw, what they would call progress being made. And over a series of weeks where a forest used to be standing, now there was nothing. And then in the middle of that nothing, they started diverting the seasonal streams, digging this massive ditch. I didn't understand what I was looking at first until I looked at the company maps. And they're actually, they channeled the flows of 6 different streams into one. All of those streams become Gypsy Creek, which flows directly into Lake Superior. All of the water here flows directly into Lake Superior. Earlier, you mentioned that this was a copper mine, and I said that it's not quite a copper mine. In fact, it's not at all a copper mine because copper is only 1.45% of what's coming out of the ground. The remaining 98.55% is waste containing sulfides, which can create acid mine drainage, creating heavy metals like mercury, arsenic, selenium, cadmium, lead, all of which are on the World Health Organization's list of top 10 chemicals of public health concern. And so really it's more accurate to call this not a copper mine, not even a metallic sulfide mine, which is how I first heard it referred to as, but now we've taken to calling it a waste mine because that's the number one thing by far that they are producing. And they would be storing this waste, over 30 million tons of it, in a tailings facility at the juncture of these rerouted streams. So they've been rerouted into a right angle, which obviously is a very stable angle for a stream to make. But this waste facility would be on topography sloping towards Lake Superior, 10% of the Earth's surface fresh water. This would be the closest metallic sulfide facility to Lake Superior in history. And I know I'm veering off your question a bit, but I really want folks to grasp why this is so important. There is obviously no good place for a mine, but I think even a lot of people who would regularly be supportive of mining, they can look at a massive toxic waste facility on the shore of a freshwater sea and say that's a bad idea. And not only that, but this thing shares a border on 2 sides with Porcupine Mountains wilderness. Again, that's the largest mixed old growth forest in the Midwest. It's the largest designated wilderness area in mainland Michigan. The mine site is so close, they actually want to mine underneath the state park. So, it started out with me combining my direct experience of hearing the sounds, of seeing the destruction, of seeing the stream rerouting, putting that information out there, and then combining that with my continued learning about metallic sulfide mining and just trying to make that as communicative as possible for people to understand because it's such a complex subject. I didn't know anything about mining a year ago. And they use words like tailings disposal facility, to obfuscate what is actually a massive waste facility. They use phrases like wetland mitigation to hide the fact that they're actually just destroying wetlands. And then they're digging some holes down the road and tossing in some water and planting some cattails. And they're saying, look, we're playing God. We created new wetlands. So the industry, like all of these massive industries, they use language in order to hide the fact of what they're actually doing. So I saw that as our campaign. The first thing we could do sheerly on the internet is just put out language that communicates exactly what's happening.
Yeah, I saw that on your website, Tom, and I think that's such a great way of framing it. And for those who aren't aware, who are already listening, this is actually really common in the mining industry these days. The old deposits of iron ore, copper, all the main minerals that are extracted, bauxite around the world, that were actually made up of veins of high concentration, even areas where you're pulling out nuggets of almost pure, silver or gold or iron ore or whatever it is. Those deposits have been mined long since. They're gone. And so the mining industry around the world is generally operating in these very low concentration deposits where you've got, between 1 and 5% concentration of, the target mineral, whatever they're looking for in the rocks under the surface of the soil. Sometimes even lower than that. And they're digging it all up. They're crushing it in some way with giant machinery, and then they're using some sort of chemical processing to essentially remove the minerals that they want from that rock. So at Thacker Pass, for example, it's actually these clay-rich soils that are rich in lithium, but are containing, parts per million. It's a few thousand parts per million of lithium. So it's similar concentration to what you're talking about there. So you're looking at, more than 95% of the material is going to be waste afterwards. So they'll dig up the material, put it in these big crushers and agitators that kind of break up the large particles into more smaller bits. And then they're going to use concentrated sulfuric acid to essentially burn out the lithium from the other compounds. They'll remove that through a series of machines. And then what you'll be left with is what was once clay and rock and stone under the soil that, similar to what you're talking about, these soils contain arsenic, antimony, uranium, radon, other toxic materials. And that's just going to be piled essentially in a giant mountain. At Thacker Pass, they're talking about using what they call a dry filter tailing stack, which is a new technology that's untested. A lot of professionals in the field of sort of geology and hydrology who specialize in understanding these issues actually believe that it's not going to work very well at all. And they basically put a plastic bag under it. They put a plastic sheet under it and a few water quality monitoring test stations, and they call that state of the art. To me, it is profoundly wrong, it's actually ridiculous to me because, if you or I were to go out with a massive amount of plastic and leave it on the landscape, we would probably get a fine. We would get a ticket for, what, $500, $1,000, $10,000. You see those "don't litter," or you'll get fined signs on the roads. But a corporation is doing the exact same thing, not only with this gigantic plastic sheet that they plan to leave indefinitely in the landscape, but with the mine waste itself. Um, it's it's an incredibly destructive industry. And the next question I have for you, Tom, which is a bit more, uh, uh, we can talk more about the impacts, talk more about different aspects of this, how the mine is going to operate, and so on. But I'm interested in talking a little bit more about strategy and what you all are doing and how you're organizing and what's happening on that front. And the first question I have in that, and maybe you can take this and run with it along the lines that I just mentioned, is what is the land ownership? Is this mine being proposed on publicly owned land, like Forest Service land or something like that? Or is this an actually privately owned parcel of land that's owned by the mining company? And I read on your website that the mineral rights actually extend beneath the state park, even beneath the lake itself. So what's the land ownership situation here, and how does that play into, what permits they need to get, their process in terms of what they're going through with environmental impact statements or anything along those lines?
Great. Yeah, I'll get to that question. I want to just follow up on a couple things you mentioned, which I thought were really interesting. You mentioned how they're calling this waste facility at Thacker Pass state of the art. People should be familiar with the Brumadinho Dam collapse of 2019 in Brazil, which was also a state of the art facility. It was equipped with the highest class surveillance technology, and yet it still collapsed and it killed 272 people. So, state of the art, this phrase, and these regulations and these laws that are in place, they can't account for the fact that chaos is a thing. Even if you've got experts at the top of the field who have designed every millimeter of these facilities, there are such tiny nuanced movements of the waste that occur over the course of years, and those tiny movements can build up into something massive. And that's what has happened in a lot of these waste facilities is they collapse, nobody saw it coming, nobody ever sees it coming, and that's why when it happens, you don't want it to happen anywhere, and especially not on topography sloping into Lake Superior. You mentioned how a human leaving, like a private citizen leaving all that plastic out there would get fined, and that corporations get away with so much that we are not allowed to. Another thing I've been thinking about recently is now when you go to the Copperwood mine site, after we put out some of our videos, they put up all these no trespassing signs, right? So we as individuals are not allowed to trespass on this mine site property. And yet, so much of what comes from the mine site is trespassing on other property. And that kind of gets into your question. Influences like light pollution, noise pollution, air pollution, none of that is going to stop at private property borders. And this is right next to a place where people go camping, where they seek a moment of communion with nature. And all of those things have effects on the wildlife as well. And then, subterranean blasting. Do they think that's not going to trespass past private property borders? No, that's going to affect sensitive aquatic organisms who their reproduction is very sensitive to vibration. And it's also going to affect humans who are sleeping on tents on the ground and are going to easily feel those vibrations. So, as far as what's happened since and how we are organizing, the first thing that people should know of, which is where the story takes a turn from horrifying to absurd, is that Michigan actually voted on March 26th this year to fund Copperwood with $55 million. And that's a sum which maybe is not very big for a massive company, but for a small company like Highland Copper, it is larger than their entire market cap. It's larger than all the money that they have in the bank. Highland Copper, they're what's called a junior mining company. So the main thing they do is they mine investors. They jump through the hoops, they get some permits, they mess up the area, they destroy some wetlands, and then they hope to sell it off to a more capable company. So when you give them $55 million, not just that, but you give them an official state endorsement, that greatly improves the leverage they have to get investment funds, to get grants and bank loans. Fortunately, when that grant was first proposed, it came out of nowhere. Our campaign organized, and hundreds of people, thousands of people came together, submitted many comments in written form. We spoke up at multiple Michigan strategic fund meetings. And when the grant was finally passed, they adapted it. So now the company, before they receive even a single copper penny of that funding, they have to raise 150 million on their own 2 feet. That's a large fundraising hurdle for a company which has struggled to really make ends meet over the last decade. So this is far from a done deal. And that is really the main focus of our strategizing at this point, is how do we make this project seem like such a disaster? How do we make it known that this has massive opposition, not just on the local level, but on the state level, on the national level, on the international level? the health of fresh water, of old growth forest, of this incredible outdoor recreation zone. These are collective collective assets that are of infinite value, far more than copper or anything else you could get out of the ground. And if we get enough people speaking up and making noise, and every investor and industry insider knows that there's a massive resistance against this project, they're not going to want to touch it. They're not going to want to buy the project because then you're buying a massive problem. So I think, as you mentioned earlier, the law is usually not on nature's side. If the law was on nature's side, we wouldn't have the civilization that we find ourselves in today. So we're not hoping to win this through, um, you know, challenging and winning permit fights or anything in a courtroom, because even when you challenge a permit or you find some massive flaw, their engineers just pull a rabbit out of a hat and say, "Oh, we can fix that." Right? They're always going to find a solution. But what we can do is scale up what we've been doing, make connections between people, get the word out there, build up the resistance, build up the strength of our voices collectively until everybody knows about this. This needs to transcend Michigan. And that's why you're doing us a tremendous service by helping us get word out to a wider audience.
Yeah.
And just as a final note, you asked about the permits. So they do have a lot of their pre-construction permits, but then a couple of them have expired and need to be renewed. Most importantly, Michigan has a strange, very strange rule called effective, issued but not effective with their permitting. So in other words, they can issue these permits, but they do not become actualized until the company can raise a certain amount of money. So they have a permit for their massive waste facility, but the permit doesn't become official until they have the insurance to cover it. And these insuring companies do not want to insure tailings facilities these days very easily, given all of the disasters that have taken place. But the real tragedy is the wetlands that were destroyed last year, the streams that were rerouted. They were permitted to do that, and they had to rush to do that because the permits were expiring. And so they devastated this area, even though they don't have the money to start the mine. For them, it was just checking a box. Wetlands destroyed, check. Streams rerouted, check. Forest clear cut, check. But then they don't even have the money to put the first nail into the plank. So we really need to look at how the whole permitting system works so that these kinds of projects can't just ruin an area. And then, a mine may or may not ever develop. If we get our way, it won't happen. So that's kind of the situation we find ourselves in now. I would be really grateful for any strategizing insights you can provide, either at this meeting or in a future meeting. We are meeting regularly with folks both on the ground in the Upper Peninsula in a number of towns. We're meeting regularly via Zoom with people from around the state and around the Upper Midwest. And we're just looking to scale this up as much as possible. The final point you asked about land ownership, it is on private land. It is right next door to the Ottawa National Forest and right next door to the state DNR land of Porcupine Mountains Wilderness.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for that information, Tom. It's challenging. It's definitely challenging. And the fact that the project is on private land means that they don't need a federal permit, I'm assuming. So there's going to be no NEPA process, National Environmental Policy Act process for this,
Right.
which
Yeah,
in
just
some
to follow
ways,
up on that,
yeah.
they were planning on taking water from Lake Superior. However, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers did not respond to them. And so now they have a new plan. We don't really know what it is, but as a result, they don't have to go through federal permitting. And they've also stopped really talking to the indigenous communities in the area because they're kind of cut loose now to do as they wish.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. It's, there's so many parallels. Unfortunately, there's so much destruction going on in different areas. I'm reminded of a couple different stories. One being, I used to live in Bellingham, Washington, which is, northwest corner of the lower 48 states, near Vancouver, BC, just close to the Canadian border. And there was a massive proposed coal export terminal at a place called Cherry Point. So right on the shores of the Salish Sea or the Puget Sound there, a herring spawning beach, a place where the salmon come to feed and the orca whales swim by. This is in Lummi, the territory of the Lummi Nation. And the company behind that terminal, they didn't have the proper permits, but they went ahead and destroyed something like 30 or 40 acres of this beautiful wetland forest before it was even legal for them to do so. And the only way that they were caught, and I believe they were actually fined or there was some slap on the wrist penalty for them, was because people were watching very closely. And this is the type of thing that I think corporations do quite often. They either figure that they're not going to get caught, or that the very small penalties are just a slap on the wrist, essentially, when you've got budgets in the millions, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars in this case. Um, and so I'm not surprised that they were rushing ahead, that the corporation was rushing ahead, Highland Copper, and trying to push through as much destruction as they could early on, recognizing that the more that's destroyed, the the more momentum they're creating for their own project, the more they'll be able to show investors and funders and partners and so on that, we've made progress, we're moving towards our goals, we've already done steps A, B, and C. And the more they'll be able to say to, any permitting agencies, anyone who's concerned about environmental impacts or cultural impacts, the more they'll be able to say, well, this has already been impacted. The area's ecological integrity is already, this has already been done and it can't be undone. So might as well just go ahead and build the thing. We need to move forward with it. Um, so yeah, and I'm interested to hear too, Tom, that you all have been building alliances and trying to work together with folks across the region. Um, what do you think the timeline is for the next steps in this process? Do you have any sense of what the next year is going to look like, or 2 years? When do you think that the company may try and move from this early exploration phase, which it sounds like maybe is done for the moment or is in sort of a paused state, to more intensive exploration, or even full scale development of the mine, destruction of the area?
Yeah. So on the topic of timeline, the first thing to note is that the construction supposedly would have started in 2018, but it got pushed back to 2019, then 2021, then it was going to start this year, 2024. And so reading the tea leaves on what the timeline is pretty tricky. They originally, when they applied for this grant from the state of Michigan, they were saying construction would start in 2024. However, when they didn't get that money with no strings attached, now they have delayed construction until 2025. And so one hope, rather than a clear, resounding defeat, is that we can just delay this until they go bankrupt and the project goes dormant. So the timeline, what we know is that this summer they plan to do their wetland mitigation. They destroyed these wetlands last year. Now they're going to make some new ones. I don't know how you can make an ecosystem which has been developing over the course of millions of years, how you can just create that out of thin air. There was a meeting with Michigan's regulatory agency is called EGLE, EGLE, meaning Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. And they were holding a meeting about another mine in Marquette County, which wants to expand its waste pile, its iron ore waste pile, and destroy some historic wetlands there. Some of the oldest beaver dams in the upper Midwest will just be completely covered by waste. And so I asked in the meeting, because it was open to public input and they were asking for questions from the public, I asked them, when you do wetland mitigation, do you scoop up all of the life forms from the destroyed wetland and take them to the new wetland that you are creating? And these folks were just totally incapable of even really conceiving of what I was getting at here. That they just didn't see any issue whatsoever. It's like, well, we're digging the holes, we're putting the water down, it's a new wetland. So actually, just this morning, when I stepped outside, I heard the sounds of heavy machinery again for the first time this year. And I've seen trucks going into the mine site bearing large loads. So I think they're beginning their wetland mitigation this summer. And hopefully that's all that they get up to this year. As far as who else we are working with, we're working with quite a number of organizations throughout the upper Midwest and throughout the Upper Peninsula. We're working with organizations like the Sierra Club in Michigan and Wisconsin. The Sierra Club actually submitted comments of opposition to the Michigan Strategic Fund grant, as did the North Country Trail, as did Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, which works on behalf of indigenous resources. We are working with more than organizations, we're working with lots of individuals who are concerned about what's happening. We have a petition circulating at change.org/protect the Porkies, which just surpassed 37,000 signatures. That may not be a large number if you're talking about New York City, but consider that the population of the county here is 13,000. The county next door is 5,000. So this petition is double the size of the two counties that would be most impacted by the mine site. That just shows how cherished this area is by people in this region and beyond. The Porkies were actually ranked as the most beautiful state park in the country in 2022. People come in from all over the country. They come in from all over the world, especially during fall color season. And, you know, this seems like a somewhat trivial point when we're comparing it to the contamination of a freshwater sea and the destruction of wetlands and wildlife and all of this. But when you look at that phrase, outdoor recreation, right? This is a place that people come to because they need to reconnect with nature. They need to experience that communion, which used to just be regular life for humans, right? We evolved immersed in nature, indistinguishable from nature. And now it's important that people have places that they can go to where you can sit beside a stream and not have to hear rock grinding in the background, where you can go camping and not hear the ground rumbling, where you can take a scenic drive, which is far from an ecological thing to be doing. But when you do that and you're slogging behind a vast queue of heavy mining traffic, it's going to color your experience when you're walking next to a majestic waterfall later on. So our campaign, we're trying to approach this from all levels at once. There's the economic perspective. Mining is not good for the economy. That's why this is an impoverished region to begin with, is because it's depended for too long on boom and bust. It's not good for outdoor recreation. It's not good for the ecology. We're trying to approach this from all angles at once because different arguments are going to resound with different demographics. But we're very excited, especially in July. We're hoping to launch a new wing to our campaign, which focuses specifically on the more biocentric philosophy, the rights of nature movement, incorporating indigenous voices, with a special focus on Lake Superior. Because the name of our campaign, Protect the Porkies, a lot of people have never heard of the Porcupine Mountains, even though it's an incredible area. However, everybody has heard of Lake Superior. So when we started the Protect the Porkies, it was really to find arguments that would resonate with people in the upper Midwest, people in Michigan, people in the Upper Peninsula who are concerned about jobs. They're concerned about how do we have a stable economy. A lot of the arguments about respecting nature just because that's the right thing to do. Nature has rights whether we acknowledge it or not. It's time for humans to recognize those rights. That argument, unfortunately, probably won't resonate with your average person down the road who is just trying to make some money to put food on the table. And so that's why we're excited to be making a parallel campaign which will focus exclusively on those arguments from a biocentric perspective.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I was curious to ask you a little bit more about that, the sort of political climate in the county that you're in, the UP as a whole, and the region. I don't know much about the politics up there. Where are people at in the UP and in your area in regards to this project? What's the general tenor of the conversation on these issues?
Well, in the letters that were submitted to the Michigan Strategic Fund, there's a document of 750 pages of written comments that went in. The vast majority of them are from folks on our side of things wanting to see this stopped. There were quite a lot of letters in support, which came from local communities, but they didn't come from your average person. They came from the heads of excavation companies, the head of the construction company, folks on the city council. A lot of these people tend to share last names, or they're each other's, cousins or something like that. The connections are very tightly woven. So there's a false perception that this is supported by the community because that's what the business leaders and the government leaders are supporting. But when you actually talk to a person on the street and you describe the massive waste pile and you describe the threat to the Porcupine Mountains and the North Country Trail and all of the species of special concern on the mine site, I have found very few people that support it. And we are meeting regularly with people in the community now and holding in-person meetings. And we're excited to see this grow little by little. Yeah, do you have any advice for how to get people involved? You've been at this a lot longer than I have. As I told you earlier, I'm kind of just improvising the whole thing. And I'd be very interested to hear any advice on how to bring in different factions and sort of unite the tribes, as it were, to get people invested in making this thing stop.
It's not easy. It's definitely not easy. And especially since copper is being looked at by many people in the so-called mainstream environmental movement as a critical mineral for green energy technologies. It's very important for gearboxes in wind turbines, for electric car batteries, for all kinds of different technologies. Um, in my opinion, as I've spoken about extensively, as everyone who's listening knows, I think the mainstream environmental movement has largely been co-opted. But with that said, the grassroots environmental movement has always been aligned with the land and with water and with the other amazing life forms that we share this planet with. So, my perspective, my approach at Thacker Pass and in the other campaigns that I've been involved in has always been to take a principled stance on that biocentric perspective, but to be open to talking to anyone, to try not to alienate people just for the sake of alienating them, but to meet people where they're at, but don't leave them there, as the saying goes. That can definitely be challenging on different issues. In a case like this, it seems like, as you said, even for people who support mining in general, or are not against mining, that this project may be something that people can perceive as a problem. And that building that narrative seems like the key to me. The challenge is always finding people who are willing to speak up, to do so again and again and again, to face pressure from being in the media or being in the public eye to some extent, and to really speak up for what they believe. My experience has been that there are 100 or 1,000 people who are opposed to the mine for everyone who's willing to sort of put themselves out there in some way. And so the question for me is always how to bring people to that place of courage and to the place of taking action. In my part, a lot of that I think is connected to getting people out on the land themselves, trying to facilitate experiences for people of direct connection to the natural world. Um, with hopefully with some skillful facilitation to prompt them to consider what does acting in right relationship with your own conscience look like on this issue? What does courage look like on this issue for you? What does it mean for you to stand up for what you believe in, to be willing to sacrifice something, whether it's your comfort, your time, your money, your well-being, potentially your job, potentially your freedom, if you're willing to take nonviolent direct action, or other forms of action to stop these types of projects. Um, those types of There's a big difference. A friend was reminding me of this recently. There's a big difference between sort of fleeting intellectual inspiration. Like you hear a great speaker, or you hear a good idea, and you're like, yeah, that's great. I agree with that. And a real deep sense of commitment that comes from within, that's not triggered by this external force, but that actually is emerging from inside yourself. It's self-motivated, self-driven. And that I think is what actually leads people to take action, to transcend some of their, own perceived limitations. Um, I wish that there was an easy formula for making that happen. I don't know what it is, but it's something that I've been pondering for a long time. And I think one component of it, which you see throughout social movements historically, is a spiritual element. Like I said, I was in Cleveland recently and reading about the Underground Railroad. Cleveland was a big terminus, of course, and then people would go across Lake Erie to Canada, as slaves escaping from the South. And, so many people in the abolition movement were profoundly religious, profoundly spiritual people who were guided by these deep moral principles and this deep sense of connection to something larger than themselves. And, I have a lot of critiques of Christianity as an institution, and, the Catholic Church and so on. But regardless, that that sense of something larger than oneself, I think is in many ways the key element to effective social movements, maybe the most important thing, because it's what allows people to go beyond, to transcend a sense of self-preservation, of protecting, me and the status quo and how things are now, and being willing to do more. And that's something that I heard from you earlier in this conversation as you're talking about moving up there to find peace and quiet and connection to land. And that's, I know for you, even not knowing you well, Tom, that like that's not just a superficial, like, oh, I like to go for a walk in the in the park or something. That connects to something really deep inside you, just like it does for me and so many listeners, that there is a a deeply spiritual element to that. I grew up going camping, in Olympic National Park in Washington State, McCaw lands, and that my family would talk about it as being like our church. Like that was our church, was to go out to the coast. And we would kind of laugh about it when we said it, but it wasn't really a joke. I mean, it was serious. Like this is a place where we go to let go of the sort of traumas and difficulties of living in an industrial civilization in this era, which is so dysfunctional in so many ways, and in which we reconnect to a deeper essence of life. Um, and that is so critical. So I don't really know the best way to go forward from there, but I know that at Thacker Pass and our ongoing work with tribes in the area, their spiritual connection, their traditional spirituality has been such an important element of it. Prayers and ceremonies and this sense of reverence and connection with the ancestors who were killed at Thacker Pass, with this sort of, this sense that we are here as a direct result of those who came before us and in service of those who come after. Um, and I think that, as I get older and study these movements more throughout history, I'm starting to see more the importance of collaborating with different spiritual leaders and spiritual communities from different areas, trying to trying to access that deeper level of commitment. I just read a book by a guy named Stephen Cope, The Dharma in Difficult Times, which is sort of about this idea, using the concept, the Hindu concept of dharma, um, and looking at the Bhagavad Gita and dharma in that text as sort of being this idea of like your purpose, your sacred duty, your sacred tasks, something that you're called to do in the world. And in that book, he looks at different people in social movements throughout U.S. history, and world history, who were inspired by the Bhagavad Gita, or read it, or sort of embodied it, regardless of whether or not they had read it. They embodied some of the narratives in that. So I realize I'm not describing something that's easy or simple at all, but I
It
think
makes
that
perfect
that's
sense.
yeah, I think that that's where my mind's going increasingly on these social movements, is like it's so easy to come in as a young person like I did, in my early 20s, to radical environmentalism and trying to defend the land, and think like, oh, we need to make great Facebook posts and stuff like that. And it's not that that type of engagement isn't important, but it's superficial. And to me, the bigger question is like, how do we build deeper capacity for action over the long term? Um, and that I think is in ultimately it's in service of stopping a mine like where you're at dealing with this mine, but also recognizing that the mine you're dealing with is one symptom of this global crisis that continues to unfold, of this global, sort of crisis of human disconnection and trauma cycling and destruction of the planet and the evolution, technological escalation of these really destructive ways of life. Um, so that's probably the least helpful, most most
It's actually
human serving.
very helpful, because that's exactly what we're hoping to begin sowing the seeds of with this next phase of our campaign that I mentioned. Is how do we bring in that spiritual element? How do we bring in that deeply inspiring element, more than just looking at statistics and citing studies and all of this? How do we make people want to go from that Facebook post of ones and zeros and actually step into the real world? So much of technology, like this technology right now, is opening this channel between us, and we're able to talk and share these ideas and spread those ideas to others. And that's incredible. But so often, corporations are using technology really as a weapon to separate people from direct participation with the world. Now all of these meetings with regulatory agencies and with environmental contaminators, you used to be able to go and attend them directly and wave picket signs and get in people's faces. Now more and more they happen over Zoom, and more people are involved, right? But to a less profound level. So technology is a double-edged sword. That said, it's an amazing tool, and I do think we can use it. Um, how do we inspire people? I think in this next wing of our campaign that we're hoping to launch, we want to incorporate art and music and poetry and get people to really look within themselves and see how they can express their connection with the land and with the water, with the mountains, with the biosphere. Because what happens is, so often when we look at this ecocide which is taking place, we feel anger. And anger is amazing. Anger is important here. Like, you talk about nature as a church. What happens when somebody comes and burns down your church? I mean, how would you expect somebody to respond when their temple is destroyed, right? With extreme amount of anger. However, I used to feel a lot of despair. Uh, Anger combined with despair can lead to paralysis, I think, or it can lead to um, a lot of energy for a short while and then burning out. What the establishment is most afraid of is anger and happiness. That combination of people who are fighting to the death to protect something, but they're doing it with love and happiness, and it's built around connecting with others. Um, you mentioned the Bhagavad Gita and the inspiration that that has given you and so many others. And I think there's a concept out of the Bhagavad Gita, karma yoga, which really fuels so many activists, which is that you work without thinking about the results. Clearly, we want to defeat the mine here, right? That's what we're trying to do. But that isn't necessarily what is fueling us. What is fueling us is the connections that we're making. It is the inspiration that we are inspiring. It is all of this stuff happening underground. I often liken it to the mycelia of mushrooms. which is all about connections, right? First, you got some separate spores. The spores reach out with mycelia. The mycelia connect. Once the density of connections reaches a certain concentration, that's when the fruiting body sprouts. That's when you get your prize. And maybe somebody comes along and they stomp that mushroom down, and things don't turn out like you wanted. But the mycelia underground continue on. And maybe the second flush is 1,000 times larger than the first flush, right? So I think if, we're all involved in our separate campaigns and our separate battles, but if we see the connections that we're forging as the true prize here, even if we don't win all of these battles, we can still win the war so long as people feel inspired, they feel happy, and they feel that this is part of a community that they're developing. Even if we don't have the firepower today to make it happen, we might tomorrow or we might next year if people forge ahead, not just angry, but angry and full of love.
Yeah, well said, Tom. And of course, you probably know the famous quote from Che Guevara about a true revolutionary is guided by deep feelings of love. And I mean that to me is it also reminds me of a Chris Hedges quote, which is we don't fight fascists because we're going to win, we fight them because they're fascists. And it's something that I've struggled with myself, that so many of my friends and people I know and work with have struggled with in the environmental movement and the biocentric movement, because we're losing the fight for the planet. We're losing badly. Everything is far worse than it was when I was born. I just turned 36, and it's getting worse faster than ever. And whether you're looking at rates of species extinction, carbon in the atmosphere, old growth forest destruction, all these different issues, they're all headed in the wrong direction, perilously fast. And our efforts to this point have not been enough. I was reminded, I was in a class this morning, I'm doing a master's degree right now, and I was reminded of a quote from Thich Nhat Hanh that took a, I wrote it down here, and it was a meditation, and it was breathing in, I know that this civilization is going to die. Breathing out, the civilization cannot escape dying. And I loved that because it was a reminder to sit with the reality of what is happening. This culture, this civilization, this industrial society in which we live in is destroying everything around us. It's destroying life on Earth, and it's undermining its own foundations of survival. And it will not last, because that's the definition of unsustainability, is that it won't last. Um, and I want to be as effective as I possibly can and do every single thing I can within my power uh, to to make the world a better place, to stop mines, to stop pipelines, to stop the destruction of the planet in every way. And what I have control over is the actions that I take, not the outcomes that come from those actions. And so so much of my work is really dedicated to trying to create a world where it is unthinkable to not defend the land, to not fight to defend the land, that it's instinctual, that it's like if you're walking down the street with, your best friend or your partner or your mother, and somebody comes along and slaps them in the face, you react instinctively, you defend, you protect, you take action. You don't stop to think, you just do it. You do whatever's needed in the moment using all your strength, all your intelligence, all your experience, because it would be unthinkable to not do that. Um, and it's really wonderful to meet you and connect to so many other people on this show that are thinking and taking action along the same lines. So we're running out of time, Tom. I'd love to have you on the show again at some point to discuss this more. I know that we've been emailing a little bit about some of the outreach activities that y'all are planning later this summer. But I'm curious, for folks who are listening as we wrap up, any final thoughts you have, but also how can people support and get involved, whether they're local, regional, or located far away?
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me on the program, Max. As I said earlier, the main battle here has just getting word out because this has been proposed for 15 years. It was blending into the background, even in the conversations of environmentalists. People would go to the mine site, ask if this was where the copperwood was, and they would be told, no, there's no mine here. So really the main goal from the beginning is to get people involved, to get people connected, to get people educated on what's happening. We've talked a bit about the larger battle here. These mines are popping up all around the country, definitely out west, and increasingly in the upper Midwest as well. This is a very mineral-rich region. And it's being justified because we need these new technologies, right? People take it as something that doesn't need to be questioned, the same as manifest destiny, right? This is an agenda which goes unquestioned and it fuels atrocities. And so when we're asking about the moral compass of humanity, is this just an agenda that is using us, or are humans still in control of our actions to some degree? I see copperwood as a pretty important litmus test. There's no good place for a mine, but next door to the largest freshwater lake on Earth, next door to the largest mixed old-growth forest in the Midwest, next door to a historic national hiking trail, if they will build a waste mine at the juncture of these incredible places, so if we can't draw a line in the sand around copperwood, then I think it doesn't bode well for the moral compass of humanity, or the lack thereof. But I'm hopeful, and I'm hopeful that people will get inspired and they will want to get involved. You can follow along by going to protecttheporkies.com. That's PORKIES. You can check out our petition. The website will give you some options at the Take Action page for ways that you can support us. We're not an organization. I'm just somebody who made a website, and we're asking for decentralized involvement. So we give you some ideas on the website, but we also encourage people to use their own creativity, to use their own resources, whatever skills are available to them. We need people reaching out on our behalf to media. We need people contacting their politicians. We need people writing to Highland Copper's investors and industry insiders. We don't know what's going to work, but like mycelia, you reach out in all directions at once and you see what shakes out. So I'm excited to see this campaign and our larger movement go forward. And I would encourage everybody to get involved, because it can be despairing at times, but it's also deeply inspiring. And I'm sure you felt this, Max, that as soon as you start speaking up about these topics and organizing folks, your quality of life greatly improves. It's kind of selfish in that way, because my life is so much better now than it was before I spoke out about copperwood. I've met so many incredible people. I've connected more with the land and with the water than I had ever anticipated. And so really the only way to lose is to not try and to not care.
This is Max Wilbert, one of the hosts of the Green Flame podcast. I want to thank you for listening to our show and let you know a few ways that you can support the Green Flame. First, you can subscribe to our platform using the podcasting system of your choice. We're listed on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Pocket Cast, and all the rest. We're also on YouTube. Leaving us a positive review or rating on these platforms helps us reach a larger audience. You can also share these shows with your friends. If you're interested in donating to support the production of the Green Flame, please click the donation link in the description of this show. And finally, the goal of the Green Flame is to activate people. So if you really want to support this show, start organizing in your own community or in collaboration with us. Thank you again for listening.